One of the questions I get so often is, what's the connection between cognitive functions and trauma? Is there a connection? And if yes, how so? So I decided to record this quick video to answer that question for you. So first off, yes, 100% there is a connection. Piaget actually said cognition and emotions are two sides of the same coin. As you improve one of them, as you improve, let's say, emotional regulation and dealing with emotions, then your cognition goes up, and vice versa. As you improve your cognition, then your emotions and emotional regulation goes up. So they are most definitely created. Actually, Ruben Feuerstein actually added that there are two sides of the same coin, but mediation is on the edges of the coin, and that's where the change actually happens. So if you want me to do a video on mediation, then just let me know in the comments and I will be happy to do so. But back to cognitive functions and trauma. Many of us know people who've had trauma and afterwards it showed up in their lives. So whether they were children and they had a really hard time functioning in school, whether they were adults and afterwards it's been affecting them at work, or just in how they're able to connect with other people. Maybe they've shut down, or maybe they're not doing work as much. They can't express themselves clearly, things like that, right? So we see more often, or it's more obvious to us, to the naked eye, how trauma affects cognitive functions, and how people just do bad in school and at work. But it's a little bit less obvious in how cognitive function affects your emotions and on your emotional side of things. So let me explain it a little bit more. Have you ever been stressed or overwhelmed or overworked, right? What happened when you were overworked or overwhelmed? I'm going to guess that you weren't specifically on your best behavior or the way that you feel most best. You probably, at some point in the process of being overworked or stressed or overwhelmed, yelled at someone or let out in a way that you don't usually do, or just your emotional regulation just wasn't in the most healthy way. Maybe you didn't let it out on other people, but you just closed yourself in and you had to hide and didn't want to get out of bed and closed up. And that also isn't healthy, right? We want to be able to process emotions in a healthy way. So most people would just say, oh, that was because you were stressed or overwhelmed or whatever the situation was. But honestly, most times, or many, many times that we are stressed and overwhelmed, it's due to weak cognitive functions. Either it's because it's too much information for our brain to handle at this time, because our cognitive functions are weak, so it causes us to be stressed, or simply not being able to prioritize because our cognitive functions are weak, so we're getting overworked, we're taking on too much information, too much actions, which also is due to weak cognitive functions. So all of these things are weak cognitive functions, which is causing us to be stressed, overwhelmed, and overworked, and then is causing dis-emotional regulation. Right? That's just one example of where cognitive functions could be affecting your emotional side of things. It could also be sometimes if somebody says something or does something, right? Your brain on a cognitive level isn't processing it in the way that it's meant to, and then it is affecting your emotions. One of my favorite ways to really understand it is Dan Siegel from Whole Brain Child way of explaining the connection between emotions and cognition. And I'm going to show you right now with my hand this example, but I do want you to read the book Whole Brain Child, whether you have children or not, because it's a fantastic book to really understand the full connection between cognitive functions and trauma. So that's Dan Siegel's Whole Brain Child. Okay, now this is what he explains. Imagine this is my brain. My hand right here is my brain, and you can do this with me together while you're watching. This little thumb right here, I'm going to put inside my hand. This is your amygdala. You actually have two little amygdalas in your brain. They're about the size of an almond, and they store a lot of emotions, specifically the high emotions from trauma, or just when emotions are running really, really high. A lot of memories, high intensity memories, all that is stored in your amygdala. Okay, now my four fingers right over here are getting covered on top of my amygdala. And these four fingers we are going to pretend are the prefrontal cortex, the front part of your brain. Okay, this is where you do a lot of your logical thinking. This is where you want to usually run your day, right? Like when you are making decisions from a logical point, you are using your prefrontal cortex. And that's like where we do our logical thinking. And a lot of the cognition is in that place. Okay. Now, most of the time, your amygdala and your cognitive functions are talking to each other. They keep on sending signals back and forth. They're connected and they have like a connection ability to just send messages back to each other. So your brain thinks of emotions, thinks of stories and memories and sending it to your prefrontal cortex to think about, and vice versa. They're just having conversations all day long, right? Now, sometimes we get what is called an amygdala hijack. There is so much emotion, whether this is from trauma or just like an extremely high emotional moment, that the lid gets flipped. There is a disconnect. There is like a literal disconnect, and there is no connection between the prefrontal cortex. It's away almost. It's like there's like a gap and there's no connection to the amygdala, to the emotion. So you see my fingers are away from my amygdala right now during an amygdala hijack. Okay. Now, during this time, you could talk rationally to a person that has an amygdala hijack, but nothing's going to go in because there is no connection. Right now, their amygdala, their emotional part of their brain is running their show. So whatever you tell them is not going to work because their brain actually cannot think right now. In order to talk to that person, you first have to bring that connection back. That is why things like deep breaths or just time to reset or going for a walk or all those other stuff that we talk about for emotional regulation is really important, because first you need to take those deep breaths and to do whatever you need to do to bring down back the lid, bring down the prefrontal cortex connection to the amygdala. And now your prefrontal cortex can be in charge again and can have a conversation with your amygdala. So a person with a lot of trauma and has a lot of things happening, their amygdala is running the show a lot more often. So it is much harder for the cognition to really be in charge of the show and take actions that a healthy person would want to take by running through their cognitive functions. Does that make sense? So here's the cool part. The more often you improve your cognitive functions, the stronger your cognitive functions are, the stronger your connection is to your amygdala. It's like a tighter rope. And that means more often your cognition can stay connected to your amygdala. Your prefrontal cortex can stay connected to your amygdala and can stay in charge instead of having an amygdala hijack. Does that make sense? So now you could really see why improving your emotions, improving your cognitive functions. Because think about like what people learn in therapy. Think about like all the emotional regulation. Think about the processing emotion. As you're doing that, many times you are also building the connections, not many times, you are building deeper ropes, deeper connections to the cognition. And honestly, many times that requires cognition in order to do the emotional regulation, because you need to do that actual thinking, right? To be able to make that connection. So now always comes the question is like, what's best? What do I do first? Do I improve my cognition first? Do I improve my cognitive functions first? Or do I improve my emotional regulation, heal my trauma, things like that? And honestly, this is like a chicken and egg situation, because many times the trauma comes from the weak cognitive functions, and weak cognitive functions comes from trauma, right? Like it goes both ways. So it will really depend on each person individually. And I can't just give you an answer just like this over here over YouTube. However, I will tell you many, many times it's best to do both at the same time. Because as you improve your cognitive functions, you'll see that therapy and the emotional regulation and all that other work works better. And as you work on the emotions, improving your cognitive function has an easier time. So literally get like both together at the same time. So if you want to improve your cognitive functions, not only to run your business easier and to have less stress and less overwhelm and just productivity and more flow and more ease, and things just happen a whole lot easier, and planning isn't overwhelming, and figuring out how to make decisions and what your next move isn't overwhelming. But you also want to improve your emotional regulation, even whether you had trauma or not, little t trauma, big T trauma, whether you just want to get like an even better time over your emotions and be able to process them in a healthy way, you'll want to apply to your entrepreneur's brain rewired. Yes, it's a 90-day cohort where we work together in small groups together with entrepreneurs to really improve our cognitive functions, right? I'm not a therapist, but I am a trained Feuerstein mediator and have been doing this for many years. So we work more on the cognitive function side while you work on your emotional side. So if that's something you're interested in, go to lifepicksuniversity.com/YABR, and the link will most definitely be below. Have an awesome rest of your day, and I'll see you next time.